Signalman story by Hulme-Beaman, published in the Cardiff Times on the 28th of March, 1903. Read by Bethina. "This is how it is, sir," said the signalman judiciously, as he pushed the tobacco down into the bowl of his pipe with his forefinger. "It gets on some men's nerves, and on some men's nerves it don't." There was a sudden sharp and peremptory ring on the electric alarm, and the signalman crossed leisurely over to the telegraph dial, upon which the needle had commenced to click with a feverish activity. It was certainly odd that I should find myself seated at 10 o'clock at night in a signal box on a peculiarly lonely stretch of line, and it was indeed due to a somewhat odd misadventure that I was there. I had happened to be travelling on this particular August evening from a little south coast watering place to its bigger neighbour, a dozen or so miles away, and had started on my journey at 9:30 o'clock. It was necessary for me to change at a midway station, a quarter of an hour's distance from my starting place, and at the end of a quarter of an hour the train slowed down and stopped. I opened the door of my carriage and stepped out. The night was dark, and I stepped away from the footboard onto the permanent way. As my compartment had been in the rearmost carriage, after the first shock of surprise caused by the results of my carelessness, and a greater degree of annoyance at the carelessness of the officials in omitting to draw the entire length of the train up to the platform, I stood still and waited. I had not the least doubt that the train would presently advance a few more yards till the extreme of the platform was reached. Somebody, I imagined it to be the guard, put his head out of the window and inquired, "Are you all right, sir?" To which I returned a not very amiable affirmative, and then the train certainly advanced. It advanced with suspiciously accelerating speed, and a moment later the red tail light dwindled into the darkening distance and left me standing on the line, alone. There was no station there at all. It is unnecessary for me to reproduce the exact language that I used, for the hour was late, the night dark, the line lonely. My indignation, however, was to an extent modified by the sight, 100 yards further on, of a signal box, of which I had at first unthinkingly mistaken the lights for the lights on the platform of the station that wasn't there. In the darkness I blundered forward along the metal, stumbling over some, it seemed to me, unnecessarily exaggerated points, and coming abreast the signal box, called to the man within. In answer to my shout, he opened his window. I explained the position to him as tersely as I could, and he did not seem in the least surprised. The thing, he said, was not at all of infrequent occurrence. "Can I come in?" I asked. For his reply he climbed presently down the ladder of his box with a lantern and showed me the way. "Now," I said, seating myself on a bench in the corner of the signal box, "the question is, what am I to do? You observe my predicament, a foolish but an awkward one, due to the carelessness of the railway officials. What on earth do the fools mean by stopping a train here, I should like to know?" "I pulled it up," replied the signalman unblushingly. "There was a block." "The deuce you did!" I exclaimed. "Then since you have got me in the predicament, my friend, perhaps you will be kind enough to suggest a way out of it. How far is it to Holgate?" That was the name of the station at which the train ought to have stopped instead of stopping at a signal box. "2 miles," replied the man, "and it ain't no use to you walking on there, sir, for you couldn't catch your train. She's due at Holgate in 10 minutes. The reasoning was pretty obvious. "You might," added the signalman thoughtfully, "walk to Willington station. It ain't so far, and I could stop a train there for you, only the station is closed for the night, so that ain't no use." "What is any use?" I asked. "The 11:15 don't stop at Holgate, so it ain't no use for you to walk there," he proceeded patiently. No, no, I said, I gather that it is no use for me to walk either to Holgate or Willington, so can we dismiss the consideration of those alternatives? But I want, if possible, to get home tonight. Then you can walk back along the line as far as Cleveley station, it ain't more than 1.5 miles, and take the 11:50 from there, if you like, sir. I can lend you a lantern to carry with you. You do it easy in 3/4 of an hour, and when I have passed the 10:25, there ain't no other train passing here before the 11:50. They might prosecute me for trespassing on the line, I objected. He waived the objection with a certain magnanimity. It's a bit of rough walking, though, he added. And I have got thin patent leather boots on, I sighed. Well, sir, said the signalman, his countenance suddenly brightening with a new idea. There's the high road as runs close by here. It takes you straight into Westbourne, straight as a harrow if you follow the windings and don't turn to the right or left. You can follow it for a matter of 4 miles and you can't go wrong. You'd get into Westbourne in a little better than an hour, same time as you'd be starting from Cleveley if you wait for the 11:50. But it's 4 miles along a dark country road upon which I have never set foot in my life, I demurred. And it's only 1.5 miles, you say, along the line to Cleveley station? Well, of course you can do as you like, sir, he returned amiably, and I'll lend you a lantern, which you must leave at the signal box outside of the station. But for people as is not accustomed to walking along the line at night, I don't say as it's not a bit awkward, you see. You might meet an engine coming along and be puzzled to get out of its way in the dark. Thank you, I said. I will take the road. He obligingly agreed to pilot me to it, if I would wait until he had passed the 10:25, when he would be free to leave his box for a few minutes. Resigning myself, therefore, to what appeared an inevitable alternative, I lit a fresh cigar and engaged my temporary host in conversation. From him I gleaned certain facts connected with the working of signalling, which impressed me with the conviction that a signalman's life, like a policeman's of operatic memory, was not a happy one. And it was in reply to a question of mine whether the long hours and the lonely nature of a signalman's duties — they are kept, he told me, sometimes on duty for 14 hours at a stretch without relief — did not tend to injure a man's nerves, that he delivered himself of the oracular remark which I have already recorded. I waited quietly while he was employed with the telegraph needles and puffed at my cigar. The clicking stopped, and the signalman turned once more towards me. Yes, he said, resuming without discomposure the interrupted thread of his discourse, that's how it is. You can't tell, it depends upon the man. I knew a man once. He paused and shook the ashes out of his pipe. Do you happen to have any baccy, sir? I handed him a tobacco pouch, from which he proceeded to fill his pipe, still in the same leisurely manner, which seemed to characterize most of his actions and movements. You knew a man once, I reminded him as he handed me back my pouch. Well, it got on his nerves bad, sir, replied the signalman calmly. It killed him. He was a pal of mine. If it's not too long a story, I began. The signalman looked at his watch. No, it ain't too long a story, sir, if you care to hear it. You've got near 1/2 hour yet. I should care very much, I replied, and settled myself down in an attitude of attention. The signalman cleared his throat, took 2 or 3 contemplative puffs at his short briar pipe, and commenced the following narrative. His name was Jim Carter, and we worked on the same box. He was a big man, was Jim, and a jolly-hearted fellow as you could meet, till gradually, as I say, his nerves began to go, and then he became sort of melancholy and would hardly speak a word for days together. And first he fancied it was his liver, and next he declared how it was his heart, and then he complained of headaches and want of sleep, till I began to feel worried about him, and advised him to see a doctor. What you want, I says, is a rest. You are a-working too hard, Jim, that's about what's the matter with you. but he wouldn't get placed on the sick list, for you see, sir, if a man once gets certified sick, the company will like as not sack him as being unfit for further duty, so many a man, rather than risk that, will hang on till he drops at his post, especially if he has a wife and family depending upon him, like Jim had. Sick? He said quite angrily. Not a bit of it, I'm all right, though I didn't say nothing as might aggravate him. Every week he got gradually worse. There came dark circles round his eyes, and his cheeks sort of sunk in, and he lost his old bright jolly expression. And as for laughing, why, he never now so much as smiled. Well, we took spell and spell about one week. It was me did the night spell, and the next week it was Jim. That's to say, from 6 o'clock in the evening till 6 in the morning. Lonely work it was in winter, too. Jim, as I say, got gradually worse. He used sometimes to start and tremble if one spoke to him sudden. I knew what that meant. It meant that his nerves were just jangled to bits, and there might be mischief ahead unless he could be persuaded to knock off and take a thorough rest. I spoke to his wife one day and tells her straight what I thought. The poor lass burst out a-crying. She knew. She had noticed it too, but she said it was no use. Jim was that afraid of being sacked that he would have endured anything rather than admit that he was incapable of running that signal box. But when he was on night duty, she told me, he never got no sleep during the day, but roamed about the cottage restlessly, scarcely speaking a word to her or the children, and eating next to nothing. And when he was on day duty, he couldn't get no sleep at nights, but would just doze off now and then for a few minutes, and then start up suddenly, muttering and scared. I shook my head, but I didn't suspect how bad it really was till one morning. It was a cold October morning, I remember, dull and gloomy. I walked into the box and found Jim sitting, as it might be, on that bench there, with his head between his hands. He looked up as I came in, and his face was dreadful white. "Tom," he said, staggering to his feet. "Tom, I'm glad you've come. I've had a bad night, Tom. Dog-tired I am, and my head has been aching miserable, and he sort of looked over his shoulder nervously. "Well, just you go home and have a good breakfast, old man, and turn in," I said, slapping him on the shoulder cheerily. "You want a rest." "Rest?" he growled. "I don't want no rest, only something has been worrying me the last 2 nights. I can't make it out nohow. There, look at that table. There ain't no up train between 11:07 and 4:35. You know that. So do I. There ain't no train." I looked at him in surprise. "Of course not," I said. "Whoever said there was?" Jim gave a curious little laugh and turned away. "Oh, never mind," he said. "It's nothing, I dare say. So long, Tom. I suppose the missus will be expecting me." "But tell me," I cried as he was leaving the box, "what's this you've been talking about trains?" "I'll tell you another time, p'raps," he muttered over his shoulder, and the next moment he was down the steps. I saw plainly now as there was something really wrong with Jim, and I made up my mind that if he got no better, it would be my duty for his sake to get him a short holiday on some pretext or other. But it so happened that I never put that resolution into effect, and I've blamed myself ever since for my foolishness in putting it off too late. The next morning Jim met me as I entered the box. He looked me square in the face, though his own was drawn and haggard, and his eyes shone curious. "See here, Tom," he says, before I had time to say anything, and his voice was steady enough. "I want to know what you make of it. It beats me altogether. You asked me yesterday what about this here train. Well, I'm going to tell you. Regular every night now for 3 nights past, a quarter of an hour or so after the night goods has gone by, that there electric communicator gives a kind of short, jerky ring, and then sure enough, without no other warning, a passenger train comes whizzing by on the up line. It ain't on the schedule. I was just a bit taken aback the first time, thought it must be a special. Yet I had no instructions about the line, and the goods was only a quarter of an hour ahead. I spoke to the next signal box. "What train is that?" I asked. He wired back, "What train?" I said, "Passenger. Passed here 2 minutes ago, travelling high speed." He wired back, "Who are you getting at?" So I said nothing more. But the next night, at the same time, the train passes again. A passenger travelling at high speed, carriages all lighted up, and the goods was in front. It dazed me so that I fell back in a heap, and I think I must have been kind of stunned or something, for when I looked at my watch it was an hour later and my head was aching terrible. The next night, as soon as I passed the goods, I waited, wondering if this here passenger would come by again. And gradually, as I looked down the line, expecting every moment to see its lights a-sweeping round the curve, I fell a-trembling so that I could hardly stand, and the perspiration broke out on my forehead. Suddenly the bell gave a sharp ring, and 2 minutes later, sure enough, round the line, I see the passenger flying along. As she passed the box, I burst out a-laughing at the ridiculousness of it, for the goods was in front, mind you, and at that rate of speed the passenger would overhaul her in half an hour, unless she was stopped by the signals, and there would be an almighty smash. Yet she passed for 2 nights, and there hadn't been no accident. The foolishness of it somehow made me angry, and also I didn't like being treated this way. I shook my fist after the train. "Go to hell," I cried, "if you like. It ain't no concern of mine. I've had no instructions." But when I got a-thinking over it, I came to the conclusion that it was my business, and that the lives of all those passengers were, so to speak, in my keeping, and the thought gave me the shivers. "If that train comes along tomorrow, Tom, I'm going to stop it." I laid my hand on his shoulder. "Jim, old man," I said, speaking slow and kind, "I shouldn't bother about this here train if I were you. I've been thinking, Jim, that you and I work too hard, and we both wants a holiday. Bad." He stopped me with a rough gesture. "Oh, none of that gammon, Tom," he said testily. "I've got my missus and the kids to think of, and I'm going to stick to my post. I can't afford to be shelved at my age." And without another word, he turned and left the box. It made me, I know, feel uneasy all that day, and when evening came I didn't like to think of Jim sitting in that box all night alone, with these images of passenger trains flitting about before his eyes, and goodness knows what sort of other silly notions are seething in his poor head the whole time, to say nothing of the danger of his bossing the signals and sending some real train to Kingdom Come, in the nervous state which he'd worked himself up into. So I decided as I would try and keep him company a little while, though it's against the rules, and it would be as much as my place was worth if I was found out. "Jim," I said, when he came to the box at 6 o'clock, looking white and tired, as if he hadn't slept a wink for a week, which I believed he didn't either. "Jim, as for this here passenger train you were speaking about this morning, I've been thinking on it all day, and in fact I'm mighty curious to see her myself. Perhaps you wouldn't have no objection to my stepping in and having a pipe with you later on, at about what time do you say she generally passes?" He turned on me, white and angry. "You'd better leave me to manage my own business, Tom," he snapped. "You know as it's against regulations for you to come into the box during my spell, so why do you ask what you know will only get us both the sack?" I saw it was no use saying any more, but all the same I was determined to drop in during the night and see how Jim was getting on, for I didn't half like the look on his face, and his eyes shifted about uneasily while he was speaking. It was a dark, nasty night, and when I looked out of the door of my cottage at 11 o'clock, a gust of wind rushed in and blew out the candle on the table. The sky was pitchy black, and I felt a drop of rain on my face. I shut the door, lit my candle and took up a newspaper, but somehow I couldn't fix my ideas on the print, and my thought kept returning to Jim and the train what he imagined ran past his box, though I knew well enough that no passenger train went by there at all. A little before 12 o'clock I heard the night goods come rattling along, and then I started, for I suddenly heard her whistling down the signals. She whistled 3 or 4 times, then ran on. "Jim's losing his head," I muttered, for it was evident as something had distracted his attention and made him forget to pass the goods till she whistled to him, and the thought made me nervous. A fast down goods was due, I remembered, at about 1 o'clock, and had to be turned on the spur a quarter of a mile further on to run a branch station. If she were allowed to run on to the main line, she would probably collide with some shunting wagons just below the points. Somehow I began to feel uneasy and couldn't sit still. It was near 1 o'clock when I decided I would make a start for the signal box, so I lit my lantern and stepped onto the road, which runs alongside of the line for 100 yards and then passes under the railway bridge. The night had grown wilder and the wind howled down the road in great gusts, and the sky was heavy and dark with clouds. I turned off the road and climbed up the incline to the line and breasted my way against the wind to the signal box a quarter of a mile further along the line. There was no sign of life anywhere except in the yellow light of the box in front, and far beyond and beside, all around, it was dreadful lonely and dark and quiet, and the wind kept howling and moaning enough to give one the shivers. I got to the box, climbed up the stairs and listened for a moment at the door. There was no sound inside, so presently I turned the handle, pretty sharp, and pushed the door open. And there was Jim, huddled in a heap on the floor, motionless and still. I took one step across to where he lay and bent down and shook him gently, for I thought he was asleep. But the next instant I saw it was a kind of swoon he was in. He must have fainted or something, for his face was ashy white and his eyes half closed and his breathing quick and gaspy. I was looking round to see if there was no water to throw on him when, sudden-like, he opened his eyes wide and sat up and stared about him like a man in a dream. Then he seed me. "Tom," he cried, passing his hand across his forehead, "it's all up. I'm a dead man." He gave a little groan and sank back. "You ain't well, Jim. You've turned a little faint, that's all," I answered soothingly. "You just wait here quiet while I runs home and fetches a little brandy and something hot." "No, no," he cried. "Don't leave me, Tom, don't leave me." Then he looked up at the clock, and at the same moment, close by, there was the rumble of an approaching train. "My God!" cried Jim, trying to start up to his feet, but he only fell back again, weak and helpless. "My God, it's the goods!" True enough it was, and the wind had deadened the sound of it, so it was upon us before we knew. I sprang to the levers as rain rushed by the box and jammed down the handle of the spur points. Jim wiped his face with the handkerchief and looked at me. "You've just saved her, Tom," he said in a curious voice. "I couldn't have done it in time." "Well, it's all right," I replied, but I felt a little shaky for another minute and the goods would have been crashed into a load of shunting wagons on the main. "It's all right, old man. Now you sit quiet and you'll feel better soon, and I'll go and fetch something for you." "No," he said again, curious and slow. "It's not that. It's not what you think, Tom, but I have seen an awful thing tonight." He gave a little shudder and then sort of pulled himself together. "That train," he says. "What, do you mean that there passenger?" I asked. He nodded. "I stopped her," he answered. "I told you yesterday I was going to." "And I did." "You did?" I exclaimed, wondering. "Listen," said Jim, sitting up, "and I'll tell you. I feel faint and weak still, but I'll tell you everything. Well, Tom, don't you go to think that this was fancy. For I see the whole thing plain and distinct as I ever see anything in my life, plain as what I see you standing there in front of me at this moment. It wanted a few minutes before 12 o'clock when the upgoods was signalled as usual, but just at that minute I saw, on in front, a red moving light on the upline, as it might be the tail lights of a train, going very slow. I pulled the signal at danger, not knowing what the red light was, and being mighty puzzled, and the goods comes and begins whistling. Presently the red light vanishes swift as a flash, and I passed the goods. Then I was taken with a fit of dreadful shivering, and felt as something was going to happen, but whatever it was, I was determined on one thing, that I would stop that passenger if she comes past. I looked out of my window along the up line and kept my eyes fixed on the curve with my hand on the lever, and a minute or two later the lights of a train came into sight, and my heart gave a great thump. I immediately signalled her to stop, and the next instant the train come flying along at 60 miles an hour, and it seemed right past the box, and yet, just as the engine got abreast of me, she pulled up dead, to an inch. and the cab of the engine was just above the level with my window. I never knew a train stop like that before, nor never shall again, Tom. Don't you believe as it was any Westinghouse breakers did it. It was something very different. I opened the window and leaned out, and what I saw on that engine gripped my heart like ice. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. I just hung on with both hands to the windowsill and trembled, for leaning over the cab rail of the engine, within a yard of me, was a skeleton, and its grinning face almost touched mine, and in the sockets of his eyes burnt 2 live coals that seemed to eat right into my brain. "Jim Carter," it said in a deep, hollow voice, "you have stopped my train. What do you want?" "Who are you? What are you?" I kind of gasped out. "My name," said the skeleton. "'Tis perhaps you might have heard of it. 'Tis not unfamiliar to mankind. Is Death. I have business on this line. This is my train, and you will see that it is always crowded." I glanced down the carriages. My God, Tom, they were full, all of them with corpses, men, women and children, lying, sitting, standing, in all positions, and all dead. The carriages were lit up brilliant, and somehow it seemed I could see right down the whole length of the train, and it was full, I tell you, of dead people. I gave a cry of horror, but the skeleton, he gave a laugh. "Be of good cheer, friend Jim," he says. "These people you see are not all unhappy. Some indeed have hurried to catch my train, even fighting for places, rather than they should be left behind. Others, again, though holding tickets, have shrunk from entering the compartments. A weak, procrastinating crew. Be of good courage, Jim. You are bold. You have stopped my train. 'Twas not for nothing, for your passport is ready." I stared at him, trembling all over, and my knees knocked together. Yet I could not so much as utter a word. I tried to speak, but my tongue choked me. The skeleton leaned more forward and put out one great bony arm. "Jim," he said, and though his voice sounded dreadful, there was something not altogether unkind in it. "Jim, I am the friend of overworked signalman. My train runs easy on fast. In it you shall find that rest and peace which of late have so cruelly eluded you. Be of good cheer, I say, for tomorrow I will reserve a place for you." And then he leaned forward and touched me on the breast with his hand, and I felt as if my heart was turned suddenly to ice. "Here is your ticket, Jim," he said. "Tomorrow we will ride together, you and I, on a long, long journey to the land of rest." And as he spoke and his hand touched me, a cloud rose suddenly before my eyes, and I fell back and remember nothing more, Tom, till I sees you standing in front of me just now. "Well, sir," said the signalman after a pause, "it may have been only a curious coincidence, or it might have been something more. For my part, I ain't a philosopher and don't trouble to try and explain things what I can't understand, but poor old Jim, sure enough, he died the very next day after he stopped the imaginary train, and all I can say is, I hopes he found that rest and quiet what the skeleton promised him and what he wanted bad. Now, sir, here's the 10:25 signalled, and in 2 minutes I can take you to the high road." He broke off to attend once more to the telegraph needle, and as I watched him, mechanical and impassive in his actions, and reflected upon the gloomy destiny of his friend James Carter, I felt a certain sentiment of gratitude to the ordainer of circumstances, that I, at least, was not a signalman. That was The Signalman's Story by Emeric Hulme-Beaman, the second of Emeric Hulme-Beaman's stories that I've read for YouTube. I think he's quite a good writer. I suspect that this story was influenced by Charles Dickens' Signalman story, but it takes a different tack. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to click the like button. And, as always, thank you for listening.